I am presenting this paper of Dr. Rita Wright of New York University. She very much wanted to be with us today, but due to some health problems, she's not here. She asked me to read her paper, so I read her paper verbatim. Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, the Indus, its rivers, and responses to environmental change. My sincere thanks to the conference organizers for inviting me to this second international seminar, Sindh Through Centuries. I'm honored to have been invited. I send my sincere regrets for not being able to attend. Most regrettable for me is not to being able to meet with the distinguished scholars in attendance and the many old friends and colleagues. My paper, Rita's, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, the Indus, its rivers, and responses to environmental change, looks to the actions taken by our ancestors when faced with environmental uncertainties in the past. While the specifics of the strategies they adopted may or may not be useful in the present, I discuss here the ways they overcame climate reversals as examples of human resilience and as inspirations for moving forward in our own time. In this paper, I turn the clock back to Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, to the peak of the Indus civilization around 4,500 years ago, and the significant changes that occurred after several hundred years when cities were diminished in size, a process that began around 2000 BC. As earlier papers have discussed, the civilization covered a vast territory that included parts of Pakistan and India, and even the northeast corner of Afghanistan, where a settlement was established for the procurement of lapis lazuli. My focus is on the final days of the Indus civilization, using the research at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro to illustrate that the timing and scale of the decline of these cities differed. My view is contrary to the results of recent research by climatologists, in which they claimed that the decline of the Indus was sudden and the result of a single cause brought about by the diminishment of the summer monsoons in northwest India. In fact, the decline of the civilization due to catastrophic occurrences is a recurring theme, many studies of civilization, and in this presentation, I hope to put an end to the idea that a single cause can lead to a total breakdown of a great civilization without accounting for the actions taken by the Harappan people in the face of change. As a historian, I approach the declining days of the Indus by examining the resilience and adaptations made by the Harappans, taking my cues from the recent events in the 2010 floods in Pakistan and in my home state of Vermont in the United States during the same year. These examples and many others have shown the options and choices taken by people on the ground by leaders and the collective actions at all levels of society. In 1989, Gregory Posel identified 8 cultural and natural areas that were part of the Indus civilization and emphasized their ecological variability, pointing to differences in their river systems, environmental features, and natural resources. I want to turn first to Mohenjo-daro and then to contrast it to Harappa. Posel identified his natural areas using modern districts, Sindh and Punjab. My focus here is on the lower and upper Indus. Field studies in the lower Indus by Dr. Louis Flamm and a team of geologists demonstrated that Mohenjo-daro was located between 2 parallel river courses, the Nara Nadi on the east and Sindhu Nadi on the west. While these 2 systems provided the city with extensive tracts for cultivation and animal husbandry, abrupt channel displacements involved realignments of the river system that would have impacted riverine travel, shifts in settlement affecting the economy and trading networks. Although few environmental studies of the Harappan period have been conducted in the region, the research by Nilofer Shaikh, Qasid Mullah, and other team members have documented the expansion of settlements at places like Mohenjo-daro. Evidence for the selection of this location may have been the result of strategies to find safer ground. Similarly, the large numbers of craft workshops which team has discovered may also represent shifting landscape features. The effects on the agricultural economy would have been subject to the most severe impacts, with rainfall levels well below the requirements for successful agricultural yields. Farmers were dependent upon the river systems and would have learned to readjust scheduling their plantation and selection of seed crops as precipitation levels and river system change. I've returned to Mohenjo-daro, but move on now to from Mohenjo-daro, move now to Harappa and the environmental conditions that differed there. At Harappa, environmental studies have shown that the city was settled on the elevated terraces area that may have been surrounded by a river meander, and at Oxbow Lake at the northern edge of the city. Small ponds may also have formed in slack water depressions or overflow chutes where flood waters collected. These would have been reliable sources of water after flooding subsided, creating microenvironment from which floral and faunal resources could be exploited. Harappa itself was located on the Ravi River, but other Indus tributaries affected agricultural potentials. For example, flow regimes of the Beas and Ravi channels created a complex alluvial basin with variable topographics and microenvironments that collectively created an extensive tract of productive land for cultivation and pasturage. The buildup of bars or raised lands that accompanied channel shifts between Ravi and Beas created surfaces that were sufficiently high to have been unaffected by floods. Harappan settlements discovered on the now dry bed of the Beas River that runs parallel to the Ravi include Harappan villages and towns in which this higher ground was selected for settlement. In addition to these differences from Mohenjo-daro, the environment at Harappa was less fragile, since in addition to the summer monsoons, winter westerlies supplied rainfall levels, even at the lowest recorded for this time period, supplied adequate precipitation to maintain its agro-pastoral economy. These very brief descriptions of the environmental conditions at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro provide a background to the types of evidence that collected by archaeologists in the past 2 decades on landscape features and use. But what evidence beyond selection of landscape do we have to the actions of people in the face of environmental changes that are indicative of adjustments made by the Harappans? This research indicates that reconstructing the effects of climate change cannot be satisfactorily understood with examining the local histories of the people that inhabited Pozel's different domains. Can I have some water, please? It is only through these that we can identify the changes and adjustments. We have already identified the dual dependency upon rainfall patterns and river systems, while the Beas drainage patterns did show frequent fluctuations in climate and large-scale stream migrations throughout 1,000 years of settlement in the upper Indus. The continued dependence upon the winter westerlies and rainfall patterns, even through diminished 2000 BC, provided adequate rainfall over the 200 millimeter minimum for rainfall agriculture. In addition, although the size of Harappan city diminished, settlements there continued for several hundred years beyond the onset of changes on the monsoons. The city was occupied beyond 2000 BC to perhaps as late as 1300 BC. Several of the small villages along the Beas also continued to be occupied. Our best evidence is from the archaeobotanical record, and that provides a window into the strategies implemented by farmers. Throughout the period of settlement at Harappa and along the Beas, farmers were making adjustments to the changing conditions of the rivers and precipitation by experimenting with different crops. Wheat and barley were the mainstays of the agriculture system, but the Harappans adopted a multi-cropping system that took advantage of changing conditions throughout the year, in which wheat and barley were cultivated in winter months, while millets, a drought-resistant crop, and some fruits were cultivated in the summer. These increasing proportions of summer crops may have documented during certain periods attesting to very specific strategies adopted by farmers in response to shifting environmental conditions. Although in the long term Harappan city was reduced in size and the Bias settlements in number, regional occupation persisted well beyond the impacts of the climate event proposed by the climatologist. The adjustments they made by the Harappan selection of landscapes and in-cropping patterns are suggesting, I have 3 minutes more. Adjustments they made by the Harappan selection of landscape and cropping patterns are suggestive of purposeful and at least for a time successful responses in changing landscape and environmental conditions. At Mohenjo-daro, the responses to environmental conditions among the city's inhabitants are less certain and require additional study. We especially lack the evidence from which to compare changes in agriculture regimes to those at Harappa. Issues like these could be resolved with the soil studies, the collection of archaeobotanical and zoological evidence. We do know that many, if not all, the sites in Lower Indus were abandoned and not reoccupied until several hundred years later, constituting a clear break with the Indus settlements in Lower Indus. The evidence we do have points to social, political, and economic factors at Mohenjo-daro. The limited information suggests that Mohenjo-daro continued to be occupied, but that it did so with a population that reduced at a faster pace than at Harappa, surely by the beginning of second millennium. In addition, there are some changes in aspects of its material culture that may speak to an altered political economy in the city's final days. Taking up routes traveled in earlier times, some Harappans displaced by diminishing economy may have migrated to the south toward Gujarat and areas from which natural resources have been imported. Scientific data from climatologists have convinced many of us that climate change is with us. Archaeologists are not surprised that climate change has occurred in the past, but we also have a strong record throughout history that when, in many instances, when climate changed, people readjusted. This view differs from many scientists that stress the catastrophic consequences of climate change and the collapse of civilization. When the Indus came to an end, the civilization's history tells us that the process was not uniform. We think it is time to examine the ways in which humans have overcome climate reversals as examples of human resilience and as inspirations for moving forward and developing strategies in the future. Thank you for your attention.